question of transatlantic unity and of Germany's position just so central to what we're all watching, and I speak only for myself, this feeling deep in my heart as I watch war break out in Europe and that reminds me of the old movies. So I think we're in for a fascinating discussion, which will be very useful for the longer term issue that I've devoted much of my life as an American diplomat to. I've worked on transatlantic Europe whole free and its peace is what I spent much of my 31 years as an American diplomat. It's such an inspiring. I am now your Vice Provost of Global Affairs here at UNC. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Barbara Stephenson. And it's a pleasure to introduce our partners tonight. We have with us, the partners are Klaus Becker from Zeitgeist. I'm going to introduce David Baffett, who will follow me up here, the chairman of Peace, War, and Defense, and Katie Lindner and her team from the Center for European Studies. Did I miss anybody else who's a major participant, Katie? That's the key one. I'd like to now hand the mic over, or the podium over, to Dr. Nathan Baffett, the chair of Peace, War, and Defense, who will introduce tonight's speakers and kick off.
I'm going to stay in that seat. I'm going to stay here.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Stephenson. We are very excited to welcome our speakers to talk about the North American Treaty Organization and NATO. This panel was planned before, but this has come at a very timely moment in our history, so we're very excited to have our speakers here. Our first speaker is Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges was a regional, he was he commanded infantry units and the battalion and brigade levels of the 101 Airborne Division in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He has also served in a variety of joint and Army positions, including tactics instructor and infantry school. And he has served in his last assignment was commander of NATO Allied Land Command from 2012 to 2014. So he is very well equipped to speak about NATO this evening. We're also excited to have Kapitän Ivo Schneider, who began his military career in 1987. He has spent 2 years as a bridge watchkeeping officer on the sail training ship Gorge Fock. Starting 2009, he joined the planning division of the Ministry of Defense and the multinational force planning in NATO and the EU. In the summer of 2021, he became the naval attaché to the United States for the embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany. So the way we will proceed is Lieutenant General Hodges will speak first. We will then shift to Captain Schneider, and then we will have a general discussion about the topics that they have raised, along with some of the questions that you might have. After we have a little bit of a panel discussion, we'll turn it over to the audience and to the virtual audience that's listening. So I will turn it over to Lieutenant General Hodges.
All right. What I'm trying to do here is set my clock so that I don't talk too long. All right. So I'm going to spend 10 minutes to give you my assessment of what's happening in Ukraine, how we got there, and where I think it's going next. But I wanted to keep this part short. And then after Captain Schneider finishes, we would like to answer as many questions as you guys have about anything that's on your mind. But I think the topic in front of us, of course, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how the Ukrainians are fighting, how the Russians are fighting, the huge diplomatic effort that's been underway, the economic sanctions, and some of those things. And that's what I want to share with you. I am grateful for the opportunity to be here, especially as a Florida State fan. Being here in the belly of the beast is, I like it. All right. Hey, first of all, Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine, is absolutely not going to fall. Ukraine is absolutely not going to be defeated and taken over by Russia. I mean, you can write that down. What we have seen over the past 7 days is a classic example of the side that was supposed to win underperforming in every single category. And the Ukrainians, the side that was supposed to be overrun and lose, overperforming in every single category, and there's several reasons for that. The part of that reason is positive leadership. I've always been a believer that positive leadership can solve almost any problem. And what we see in President Zelensky, I think he's the reason that the whole world is like, just embrace this guy. I met him 4 weeks ago. I had an office call with him for about an hour. I thought it was going to be about a 10-minute photo op sort of thing, and we ended up being in there along with Ambassador Bill Taylor, who used to be the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And he impressed me. This guy is a terrier. He's tough. He's not a career politician, so he doesn't speak like a career politician, but he knows his people. He is a career comedian. He's a comedic actor, as most of you probably know. And so even while we're talking about the threat of Russia and what's got to be done, it was almost like just below the surface, there was a joke, or he had a kind of a twinkle, and I liked him immediately. And his decision to stay and to be a very visible presence there is, I think, what has not only inspired his country. And by the way, his popularity was going down before the invasion. You know, I mean, they have really significant domestic issues in Ukraine, much like most other countries in the world, especially us. But now everybody has really embraced him. And I think it's his personal positive leadership. Without a doubt, the quote of the war so far is when he was told, hey, the United States is ready to get you out. He says, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. And I mean, it's incredible. And I think that's what really turned the tide for world support. But I would also say this is the best example of American diplomacy I have seen since 1995, when the United States led the effort for the Dayton Peace Accords. And then NATO I4, the implementation force, implemented those peace accords. It's been an amazing effort by Secretary Blinken specifically. I'm sure some of you watched his press conference this afternoon. I mean, as I'm watching him, I'm thinking, I hope somebody is working on the statue for Tony Blinken right now, because he's a wonderful example of calm, of humility, and also by the administration. I mean, you almost never see Secretary Austin, the defense secretary. You almost never see General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This obviously is not an accident. This was designed by the administration to say, we're going to lead with diplomacy, and we're going to work with all of our allies and all of our partners. I mean, imagine the challenge of getting 30 nations to agree. I would challenge you to get your 10 best friends and agree on where you want to eat supper tonight, or what your favorite beer is, or what kind of pizza you're going to get. To get 30 nations to agree on things that have significant impact on everybody's economy, huge cost and potential danger, that took American leadership. But it wasn't, to be candid, it wasn't the sort of American leadership that we saw a lot the last 4 years, where you're flogging your allies. Instead, it was a no-kidding consultation with allies, better than I've seen in decades. And it was so important, of course, that Germany, Chancellor Scholz, what he said last weekend, I mean, this was earthquake, in my view, a good earthquake, where Germany talked about defense spending, talked about we're going to support giving weapons and letting weapons flow into Ukraine, and also to stop the certification of Nord Stream 2. These were three massive things that I did not think we would hear this year, but I never doubted that our most important ally, Germany, would recognize their responsibility. And we have a terrific German Navy officer here who will be able to articulate some of that as well. So what's happening in Ukraine? Why are the Russians fighting so poorly, and why are the Ukrainians fighting so well? President Zelensky said, by the way, I don't want American soldiers in Ukraine. I don't need British soldiers. I don't need German soldiers. I need weapons, the tools so we can defend ourselves, and I need money so I can grow my army. That was impressive. And so what you're seeing is a massive effort by the West to start pushing things in there. I heard today that over 100 Stinger shoulder-fired air defense systems that are ideal for knocking down drones, helicopters, low-flying aircraft have just arrived. And this is how it happens in large-scale logistics. It's always slow, and pretty soon they're going to have Javelin and Stinger lying around everywhere because they've got so many. But it'll take another few days. I don't think that the Russians are doing so well because, number one, they do not have experience at doing large-scale operations at this level, where you've got to combine sea power, air power, land power, special forces, cyber. I mean, when everybody saw President Zelensky walking around with a cell phone on like day 4, like, how in the heck is his cell phone still working? I mean, when we go somewhere, first minute, everybody's lights go out, the phones go out. I mean, so that the leadership cannot direct command and control. Here on day 4, the president is walking around with the phone. Oh, and by the way, you know, the United States and our allies, when the bad guy's on the phone, there's usually a big bullet that lands right on top of their head because we figure out where they are. And so the Russians are not as, it seems to me, they're just not as advanced as we had thought they were. The other thing, there's a couple of giveaways, and I'm seeing some ROTC and officers out there. Part of the reason that they are doing so poorly is because they do not have the culture of readiness. I mean, when you've got vehicles breaking down before they even get out of Russia, and you've been planning an invasion for how long? That tells you the state of readiness inside Russian forces. And this big, gigantic convoy, the 40-mile convoy of doom that is dominating the news, man, if I was an Air Force guy, I would just be drooling at seeing those bumper to bumper. Why are they like that? First of all, the ground is extremely soft. And that part of Ukraine is like Missouri. I mean, it is dark black dirt, and it is very wet this time of year. And so the trucks can't get off the main road. So now you've got a convoy of 40 miles on this road. Secondly, they're bumper to bumper. That is a dead giveaway that these are young privates that are driving these trucks. They're not experienced. They're terrified. Most of them are conscripts. And by the way, a week ago, they had no idea they were going into Ukraine. And instead of being 100 meters apart, like a vehicle should be in a convoy going into a tactical situation, they're like this because they're terrified, which makes it such an easy target. And I am sure that probably within the next 2 or 3 days, most of that convoy is going to be on fire as Ukrainians work ground forces in there. The area where the Russians have the biggest advantage is on air power, and Ukrainians don't have enough drones to be able to go out there and start hitting that convoy. But I think within the next 2 or 3 days, that's going to change. Ammunition consumption is always more than you would think it would be when you're training or in peacetime. The downside of the success Ukrainians are having is that the Russians are already starting to transition to, okay, we can't beat these guys, so we're just going to start flattening the cities. And they're indiscriminately targeting civilians, missiles landing in the middle of a city. It's going to be very bad for the next several days in that regard. But I don't think they have the logistics. I don't think they have enough ammunition to sustain that. Now, why do I say, and this will be my last point, why I don't think Kyiv is going to fall? It's a city of 3.5 million people. I mean, it's a huge city. Even if 500,000 have already left as refugees, there are hundreds of buildings. There are massive hotels, apartment buildings, municipal buildings, industrial buildings. It takes about 400 soldiers to enter and clear a massive hotel. I mean, cities consume people because you have to clear every room. You're going to have lots of casualties. They're going to use up all the ammunition that soldiers are carrying. So they don't have enough people. You would need about 600,000 soldiers probably to actually encircle Kyiv and then begin to fight your way into it. And we're hearing that there's about 150, 170,000 Russian soldiers total, all around, total. Now that sounds like a lot, but University of Michigan football stadium holds 104,000 people. So you put in context 100,000, all of a sudden that doesn't sound like so many. The very complex topography of Kyiv, it's 7 hills. It's not laid out like Manhattan where you've got, avenues and streets. It's a mess that's grown up over the last 1,000 years on the banks of one of the biggest rivers in Europe. So it's not going to happen. It's going to be very bad for several days. But the Russians are absolutely not going to capture Kyiv. I'm sure of that. But there's what we can talk about maybe in Q&As. Okay, so then what? How does it end? What comes next? Nuclear negotiation. What should our relationship with Ukraine be after all this? Shipmate.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. So if you call me shipmate, then I call you landlover. Okay.
I am.
Right. Can you hear me? Is that about right? So good. Let me try to come up with an opening statement that you might remember or recall later. So why was NATO founded in the early days? It was Lord Ismay, the first NATO Sec Gen, basically saying to keep the US in and in the lead, Germany under control, and Russia out. So that was the basic idea of NATO. And that was because Germany had a massive army, was in Poland, and turned the European war into a world war when attacking Russia. Now, 80 years later, the West is applauding Germany's remilitarization, building a big army, being in Poland, which is the multinational core Northeast in this case, and being ready for attacking Russia or fighting Russia just in case it is necessary. So that is a bit of, let's say, historical irony or coincidence or whatever you name it. And why is that the case? Now, NATO has been proven an alliance which is based on values. And after the Second World War and after the establishment of Western Germany at that stage, and being a long-time member and allied partner, Germany has proven to be a reliable partner because Germany has proven to be reluctant in military affairs, in militarization, in pushing the things forward with weapons. It is always the German, it was or is always the German intention to reach out the hand and not pointing with a finger to somebody. That is one of our methods in NATO, how we actually understood NATO and how we understood ourselves as a NATO partner and alliance. Now, the last couple of days and weeks have proven that the so-called peace dividend is over. After the reunification, Germany was surrounded, encircled, as we said, by friends. There was no need of having a big army. When I joined the forces in '87, we had the Bundeswehr of about 580, 590,000 soldiers. The reunification in 1990-91, when the former East German army came as a surplus basically to the West German army, we were roughly about 900,000. So when Europe was really kind of looking at Germany, does that feel right? And it did not. For France and Norway, Denmark, Belgium, yada, yada, yada. So we stepped down. We dismantled a lot of capabilities on purpose. And it was also a part of the 2+4 treaty from 1990. And ever since, Germany has been, let's say, a trustworthy and reliable partner and was always thinking twice. If in case yes, how to employ soldiers. Now imagine Germany would have deployed arms to Ukraine, let's say half a year ago or months ago, and those Panzerfaust and anti-tank weapons and whatever with a German signature on it and a Versorgungsnummer, as we say, a supply number on it, were actually hitting Russian tanks and being stuck in Russian soldiers. Now, the Russian propaganda would have made exactly what we would not have wanted to be made, propaganda out of it. Another time, German weapons against Russian soldiers, tanks, and vehicles. No good idea from a German historic perspective, okay? But what happened then, the aggression, the attack of a single politician, I would say. We're not talking the Russian people. We differentiate between the Russian people who do not want war and a, I would say, sad individual who really wants it. That attack really resonated with Germany. And Chancellor Scholz, he gave a speech on Sunday in the parliament, and he promised to ramp up defense budget in a singular way, double the defense budget for 2022. So we are now around 50 billion euro for 2021. And in 2022, we are receiving 100 billion. So that's doubling the defense budget. Imagine what that would be in the US. I mean, you would have that kind of budget. It's the question, what are we going to buy with it? Okay, that's a different question, but I would say ammunition is probably a good idea. New aircraft, Tornado replacement, perhaps with and in the US, the F-35, and a couple of other things as well. So I would say there is a good opportunity for spending that money, but then most importantly, the 2% target is to be anchored into the German constitution in order to fix that. Now, let me have one more point, and I haven't got a stopwatch here, but let me have one more point. NATO rules say when you finance NATO with a specific amount of money, you would receive or you would be eligible for a specific number of flag officer posts in the NATO command structure and force structure. Had Germany paid so much money into the NATO fund, then let's say every third or every fourth NATO flag officer would be a German general or admiral. Now, there are a couple of nations who don't like that idea. And I'm really European, truly European, but in kind of societies and peoples, there is still some resistance. No, we don't want to have this German domination. And for a good reason, probably. So Germany stepped back, paid its contribution, but on purpose, not the amount Germany should be paying, because then automatically Germany did not fill or had to fill these command posts, flag officers posts in the NATO command structure. And by this way, left the opportunity for France, Belgium, Denmark, and other countries to actually fill these positions. Quite happily so. So let's see what the future brings. I would say there needs to be kind of compromise. Germany will really pay to NATO, and probably more than we did in the past. To my knowledge, Germany is the third largest contributor to NATO funding. It's US, UK, and then Germany. And I think that will stay about this. It's either be the second or the third largest contributor. But we will maintain with a good sort of natural eye our obligation not to overdo it in the command structure. So there will be a solution, which I cannot really tell you because I don't know it yet, but it is a matter of military diplomacy not to overdo it and overstretch it. And as we speak, Germany has reinforced battle groups and battalions headquarters along the eastern flank, I would call it, in Poland, Lithuania, the battle group, and so on, and also with the Navy, with its relatively small Navy, because Germany is a land-oriented country. The Germans love the sea, most of the times from the beach. That's why we have a small Navy. But this small Navy is now contributing to presence operations in the Baltic, which is our home area, I would say, our home sea, and in the Mediterranean. Germany contributes to all four of standing NATO maritime groups. And with a few months of exception, Germany has ever done so since 50 years. All four of them. And that's, I would say that's quite a challenge, and it was achieved. So let's see what the future brings. And I do really hope that we find a diplomatic solution for the Ukraine, because at the end of the day, I would say, and this is my personal opinion, I make that clear, though I sit here in uniform and it's an official appointment, but I would say the Ukraine situation gives a very good blueprint for another potential conflict thousands of miles away to the east in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm pretty sure that China is watching this very closely, what the alliance does and what the US do when it comes to solving this kind of conflict. There are differences because Ukraine is a piece of land and Taiwan is an island where you have a couple of, not hundreds, but a large amount of water around, and you can change geography in a way you couldn't with respect to Ukraine. But I think they are watching it. And my personal opinion again is in 2024, when the US is heavily engaged with itself with the next presidential elections, and then the president is a lame duck for about 1.5 months. It's a good opportunity to try a grab, I would say. So let's see. I'm not carrying coats to Newcastle, I would say in English, but let's see what comes out. So that's my opening statement. And over to you again, and please feel free to raise any questions.
Thank you both very much. So we're going to have just a little bit of a discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll turn it over for audience questions. So both of you, thank you very much for your presentations. They're very, very enlightening. The first question I have is that in this since the attack on Ukraine, at least I've observed just incredible enthusiasm for NATO, incredible enthusiasm for collective defense. The question I have is, how long do you think that enthusiasm will sustain, given the significant challenges that Europe is facing as far as energy security, as far as it's right on their border, there's likely to be refugee flows, there already are significant numbers of refugee flows. How long do you think this can sustain? Will it work for the indefinite future as long as Russia appears to be a threat, or is Russia going to be able to exploit cracks? Because that does seem to be their strategy since the Putin era, at least. So I wonder if you both could comment on that.
Go ahead, please.
So this is an opportunity for the United States to work to take advantage of these relationships that have been reinvigorated with a clarity with a clarity from about what the threats are, and a realization that disarming only invites provocation. Everything that Russia did, invasion of Georgia, invasion of Ukraine, support for the Assad regime, happened after we all disarmed. When the U.S. Army in Europe went from about 300,000 to 30,000, and the last American tank went home, when the German Bundeswehr went from this force that Kapitän Schneider talked about down to what it is today. And when the British Army left the continent, went back to the island, that's when they attacked. So I think there's a new level of realism about that should help. But I think, fortunately, this administration seems to have an approach of, well, you heard President Biden on the day of his inauguration. He specifically mentioned alliances as a key focus. That's amazing, because you can imagine how much fighting there is to get everybody wants to get their line into the inaugural speech. So the fact that the administrations thought it was so important to keep alliances in that inaugural speech, and then he has reinforced that day after day after day. I think this will help our allies want to be a part of this, that it's not an American-led and we're smacking them over the head because they're not paying enough, that sort of thing. But it's a much more, and I'm not naive, but I think it's a much more, a better sense, like it was in the beginning of the alliance. Now, of course, you're right, every nation has challenges, has economic challenges, and there's going to be a massive cost to help with the recovery of Ukraine. But that's going to be important because millions of people depend on grain from Ukraine in the Middle East. So if we don't get that going again, there's going to be other problems. But I think people realize that climate change is not the threat. It is a threat, but it's not the only threat that we face, and you have to be realistic about preparing for it.
Okay. NATO is the premier security alliance. EU is seen as the premier economic alliance. But when you look at the contract or the treaty, then the EU treaty is actually much more binding when it comes to security than the NATO treaty is. So Article 5 tells you, Article 4 is consultations, and Article 5 is every country should assist as good as possible or with best possible means. The EU treaty makes an obligation. There's no thing like best possible such and such. It's a hard obligation. in this situation, I believe if there is any solution that allows the Russian side to keep the face, then it's not going to be a NATO participation over the next foreseeable years, but potentially a EU participation. Because NATO is what the Russians do not want. EU is probably likewise, but they didn't say it that clearly. I mean, 2014, it was no coincidence. It was meaningful, it was on purpose that the invasion of Crimea happened about 2 or 3 weeks after the Ukrainian approach to the EU, not NATO. So let's see how it comes out in this case. I think NATO is the big gorilla in the room, which the Russians try to avoid. So there might be a chance of getting Ukraine into EU and postpone any NATO membership, let's say, to 10 years or so, or after Putin dies or is not in office any longer. Personally, I also believe that if it comes to kind of peaceful ending to this conflict, that Putin will not be in power for very much longer. And then we do have a different government, and they might see a NATO membership from a different perspective. But I do believe, as I said, it's not a short notice issue. It's going to be something for, let's say, in 10 years. Yeah.
Formulate this question. I'm celebrating, as someone who worked on a Europe whole, free, and at peace for much of my career, this great moment of NATO unity, because it was tough. August was a very tough month for the alliance. Allies felt that they were not heard, even if they were consulted. And the departure from Afghanistan is not something that anyone can feel proud of, even if there are reasons why it made sense to bring a long war to an end. So there's this moment where I'm celebrating the unity of NATO, but at the same time, feeling slightly awkward listening to my president be so clear with the Ukrainian ambassador that the United States stands with you, and then watching these images and knowing that standing with you means we're not going to be by your side for this fight with Russia. And I wonder, how does that play out over time? Do you feel does anything feel odd to you about that this is a moment of great unity and solidarity with Ukraine, but that the United States is not going to come and fight and Ukraine is kind of on their own? I know Zelensky said what he needed to say, which is send me ammunition, and he's getting ammunition in a way that he hasn't gotten before. And General Hodges, I so hope you're right that Goliath is felled by the stone thrown by the Ukrainians, but my God, Russia's got so much more power. Does NATO start to look, is there something just after in 2008, the NATO summit declaration said Ukraine will become a member of NATO. That was years ago now, more than 13 years ago. They've been left in what Roger Cohen called a treacherous sea of vagueness and left adrift. Does NATO come out of this looking good, or is there a way that this actually turns to what NATO did and leaving Ukraine in such a vague state was harmful to Ukraine, and that NATO is seen as not so much the good guy in this? What do you think about that? It's very complicated watching this play out, and we're up against a master of misinformation.
Yeah, okay. As you look at me, I take the first shot, and I come from two angles. So the first thing is, let's go a little bit by the book. NATO is not supposed to take up any new member when there are interior and border conflicts, because that would automatically drag the entire alliance into a war. Let's face it. And nobody is interested in having that. So by the book, it's a very, very good solution not to over-exaggerate that process and allow whatever process to settle in order to get Ukraine into NATO. I believe it will happen eventually.
That Ukraine will?
Yes, I think it will happen. Let's say in about 10 years, maybe a little bit less. Now, my second approach is have a look at the world map. Sometimes it helps to stand back and look. Ukraine European problem. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically that's the theater of operations. And there's another one in the Indo-Pacific, which is not NATO, not North Atlantic, it's Indo-Pacific, but there is another hotspot about to develop. So if you want to avoid a two-front war, then you need to have one alliance dealing and taking care of one issue and another alliance or conglomerate of partners, I would say, dealing and taking care of the other. And I would say we are steering towards NATO, focusing on Europe, and the US promoting that by intentionally withdrawing or stand back and save their aces for another issue in the Indo-Pacific. And in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to be not NATO and not a formal alliance, but let's say a coalition of partners and the willings and so on in order to deal that. In the European theater, I think there is a fair chance that you can change Russia, the leadership. You can change things in that country. In China, you can't. But you can change the countries around China, which is not necessary in Europe because they are already more or less changed. So you have a different situation. In Europe, you can change the main player and you don't need to change the neighboring countries. And it's the other way around in the Indo-Pacific. So NATO deals with one and a set of partners and coalition of the willings deals with the other. Okay.
So I don't agree with everything that Captain Schwartz has said, but I would go along with most of it. For the United States, Europe is not Europe's problem to solve on its own. Our economic relationship with Europe, with the European Union, dwarfs any other regional economic relationship. So even if not one European country spent €1 or pound or zloty or krona on their own defense, it is essential for us, for our prosperity, that Europe remains prosperous, which means it has to be stable and secure. So we are always going to be focused on European security and stability for our own purposes. That was an unfortunate choice of words, I think, by President Obama. He said we're going to pivot to the Pacific because that kind of implies turning away. And long before President Trump appeared, I had a lot of my European friends saying, are you guys leaving? I mean, what's going on here? So our Navy and our Air Force for sure are going to be prioritized into the Indo-Pacific region. But land power for the United States is going to, I think, continue to be important in Europe. We have about 35,000 now permanent Army there, and probably about 20 to 25,000 permanent Air Force that are in Europe, mostly in Germany and in Italy and in UK. I think one of the outcomes of President Putin's terrible miscalculation is that he's going to get exactly what he didn't want, is American soldiers permanently based in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic countries. Not moved from Germany to there, but additional. We don't need 300,000 again, but I think a recognition that our good faith effort to abide by the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which said no permanent basing in former Warsaw Pact countries or former Soviet republics, was rewarded by Russia invading Georgia and Ukraine. So I think we're going to undo that mistake. Now, to the point of the initial point of your question, Ambassador, it's incredibly frustrating to kind of be sitting in the bleachers in a way like, God dang it, I want to get in there and you know, we need some paratroopers in there, we need some Apache helicopters riding up and down that convoy and, you know, U.S. world's greatest Air Force lighting them up. But the Ukrainians really don't need that. I mean that. What they need is to be part of a strategy by the United States for the Black Sea region. I love Ukraine. I've had this ribbon that a Ukrainian woman gave me several years ago. I was in uniform there near the city of Lviv. There's a training area out there. And she comes walking up, and we're waiting by the bus to go out to the training area. And she asked my escort, said, who is this? And he said, well, this is General Hodges from the U.S. Army. She just burst into tears immediately and gave me that ribbon off of her purse. And so I've been carrying that around now for about 7 years. And it's what you represent. people have such high expectations of the United States. They know that we're not perfect. They know we have plenty of problems of our own, but they still have such a high expectation. Whenever we live up to our own talking points, that's a powerful signal. And so that's why I carry that ribbon as a reminder. But Ukraine is not an island. We've been talking about it like it's an island for the past 8 years. Should we give them javelin? Well, that's not strategy. That's a policy decision. And what a ridiculous argument to have. Of course, we should be giving them boatloads of javelin, but it should be because it's based in a strategy for the region. Why does Ukraine matter? Not because we love the culture, we love the incredible people, have really good child there. It's because of where it sits on the map. It's the reason that Catherine the Great annexed Crimea at the end of the 18th century, because Russia desperately wanted a year-round warm water port that would give them access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and into the oceans of the world. So if you can step back from the map a minute and think about, okay, there's Ukraine. This is my invisible map. Ukraine, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, Moldova. Moldova, by the way, remind me to talk about the state partnership program. North Carolina is the state partner of Moldova. And then you've got Georgia over here in the Caucasus. These countries around the Black Sea, we have 3 NATO allies. So we have a treaty obligation to come to the defense of Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. The Black Sea is the launching pad for Russia for everything bad that they do in the Caucasus, in the Balkans. The Assad regime should have been gone years ago. But because we didn't really do anything about it, the Assad regime jumped right over the president's red line about chemical weapons, and the Russians were able to send endless amounts of Scud missiles and other capabilities into Syria by going through the Turkish Straits to their big Navy base in Tartus in Syria and keep the Assad regime afloat, which resulted in about 3 million refugees coming from the Syrian civil war into Europe, which dramatically changed the whole political landscape in Europe to the worse. That was not an accidental collateral damage. That was the Russians' weaponization of refugees. They knew exactly what was going to happen here. And then, of course, they used the Black Sea as the launching pad into the Eastern Mediterranean and into Africa. So if we're not competing in the Black Sea region, then the Russians have unfettered use, and they're able to do whatever they want. They're almost never challenged on the seas there. And so that's why we have to have a strategy. So to contain them, to protect our allies, economic potential for this place is incredible. There are 3 major sort of corridors between Europe and Eurasia. One goes through Russia, one goes through Iran, and then the potential, one goes through the Black Sea region. So how great would it be if we opened up or invested in the economic potential of this east-west corridor through the Black Sea, where Georgia becomes the portal, the gateway between Europe and Eurasia? Massive investment opportunities. And of course, the Russians don't want that, because then you would have the German parliament, the English parliament, the American Congress poking around, and they're like, why do we still have Russian soldiers in Georgia, occupying 20% of Georgia? Why do we have Russian troops in Armenia and Azerbaijan? So the Russians have resisted that. But because we don't have a strategy, we haven't invested there. And then the final reason this region matters is because the Black Sea and Turkey in particular are a bulwark against Iran, a bulwark against Islamic extremism. So if you think strategically, of course, we're not happy with how President Erdogan treats journalists and a lot of other decisions he makes. But he's not going to be there forever. But that geography of Turkey is going to be there forever. So if we're thinking strategically, then you can understand why Ukraine is so important. And if we're operating all around it, instead of worrying about should we give more Javelin or Stinger, or how do we get more ammunition in there, the Ukrainian land forces actually outnumber Russian land forces inside Ukraine. So they don't need American troops there. They probably would like to have a little bit of U.S. Air Force in there, but no fly zone. We could talk about why we're not going to do that. But otherwise, that's a terribly long, poorly constructed answer to an important question.
Yeah, definitely full of insights. If I can ask a follow-on. So we've talked about strategy. We've talked about the critical nature of the Black Sea region. of Ukraine potentially joining NATO, right? And all that's, again, based on what you've described, it sounds like a grand strategy. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like something that would be in the interest of the United States and of Europe. But I wonder if we look at that from the Russian perspective, right? If we look at that rhetoric and we talk about Ukraine joining NATO, we talk about this expansion of this economic zone across the Black Sea. From their perspective, does that look like Ukraine has to fall in their favor? And if it won't fall in their favor, based on what they're doing right now, will they start destroying it? They essentially reduce Kiev to rubble, right? Start to use artillery, start to use indiscriminate bombing, just to prevent this future where they're effectively isolated due to NATO's growth and due to the United States' growth of influence.
Well, that's the Kremlin's number one talking point from their little fairy tale about why why they're so threatened. That NATO is encircling Russia somehow, and that NATO is going to put nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It would an absolute total. That's worth 10 Pinocchios. Whenever Lavrov says that, or President Putin says that. I'm sure most of you have seen the map. It's been out on social media. It shows the entire map of Russia, and the part that NATO touches is about 6% of Russia's frontier. So the idea that somehow NATO is encircling Russia, of course, is ridiculous. And the safest part of Russia's entire frontier, of the entire country, the safest part is the part that touches Norway and the 3 Baltic countries and Poland and Romania on the Black Sea. That's the one place where I would guarantee, I would make €8 million that Kapitän Schneider will pay, if I'm wrong, that Estonia will never invade Russia. I will make a huge bet right now that Lithuania will never invade Russia. But because President Putin he would have a hard time, even him, telling his own population why he doesn't want Ukraine to join the EU. I don't want Ukraine to be prosperous and happy. So it's all about NATO. Because what he really fears is Ukraine joining the EU, not joining NATO. But it's more convenient to use that as the excuse. Now, I think you still make a fair point that we should always take into consideration the security concerns of any sovereign country. The legitimate security concerns, of course, we should take that into account. But in the 21st century, I don't think that the Kremlin gets the right, nor does Washington, D.C. get the right or have the authority to make decisions about foreign policy of other sovereign nations. And I think that's why the alliance has stood fast. And remember, all 30 nations have stuck, even if half of them don't want Ukraine to join NATO, this principle that the Kremlin does not get to veto decisions by other countries is so important that our alliance, at the risk of a nuclear war starting, has stuck together. That's the art of diplomacy by our government, and also recognition by our allies. Exactly as Ivo said, NATO is based on values. And there are some things that you have got to be willing to fight for and to take huge risks because they're more important than the price of gas.
Okay, let me add one point, and I'm not giving away too many details here, but again, have a look at the map. And I think Putin is afraid of a tight cordon of Western missile defense systems. So when it comes to nuclear parity, there's also a potential missile defense system in the countries, which you can look up. So it's Turkey, it's Romania, it's wherever. And when the NATO strategy tells you the NATO alliance area requires a 360 degrees protection, that's what the buzzword is, 360 degrees coverage and protection, then there are white spots on the chart, on the map. And so NATO as an alliance is very interested in closing this gap, and Ukraine is a part of it. So in fact, we are talking about a race for land, either attacking missile systems pointing to the west or defensive missile assets protecting what comes from the east. And whoever is there earlier wins the race. So you could see it from that perspective. And I think that's what, not what it is all about. I agree, it's about EU and everything. It's the model of life. And when the Ukrainian brother people, so to speak, demonstrate to the Russian people how a life could be led, that's going to undermine the entire theory of life from the oligarchs, from Putin and his opposed in Russia. So what Putin does is essentially protecting his own life and inner circle and his kind of leadership. It's not about the Russian people he's, let's say, supporting and what he's aiming for. Not wealth and well-being. It's about his personal circle and himself. And the other model, Ukraine and the entire West, the liberalism, so to speak, is about the people, is about millions of people and well-being. And when the one beats the other, and it's going to collapse. It's going to get an implosion, and that's what Putin is afraid of. Over.
It seems like he thrives on chaos for sure.
Yeah.